All right. Well, welcome to Module 3 of the Community Housing Guide training. This module provides information on how to support people through the process of obtaining housing and supporting them to maintain their tenancy. After completing Module 3, Community Housing Guides will understand how to conduct a tenant screening, develop a housing roadmap, assist a person during the rent assistance, housing application, and transition process, and put supports in place to maintain tenancy. Before we review the material in this module, there are a few housekeeping items. First, all participants must complete and review all material in the module. If you are familiar with content covered in Module 3, we encourage you to view it as a refresher and then proceed to the final exam. If you'd like more information on topics that are covered in this module, please visit the link seen on this slide and scroll to the key resources for support coordinators and community housing guides section. There's also a frequently asked questions document available for download by clicking on the Attachments tab. The remainder of the instructions in this housekeeping slide are applicable to when we place this module on the Commonwealth of Virginia Learning Center. So first, we're going to review the steps of the tenant screening process. The purpose of the tenant screening is to identify housing preferences, explore housing strengths, review the steps to prepare for independent living, uncover housing barriers, identify specific housing needs, and review eligibility for housing options. Community housing guides are required to perform tenant screenings so they can develop person-centered approaches to supporting individuals through their transition to housing. A tenant screening form is available in the FAQ for Module 3. Use this form to document completion of a tenant screening. The first step in a tenant screening is to identify the person's housing preferences, including the neighborhoods or communities where the person would like to live, the kind of building the person wants to live in, for example, a garden apartment or a high-rise. The unit characteristics the person prefers, for example, a ground floor unit, a unit with utilities included in the rent, or a unit with carpet, and the people with whom the person wants to live, if the person does not want to live alone. The next step is to explore the strengths the person has that he or she can use throughout the transition to housing. Housing strengths include activities the individual can do independently or with minimal support in housing, technology the person uses that enhances independent living, such as a cell phone with an app to provide timed reminders, an electronic medication dispenser, or a communication device. Strengths can include natural supports who will assist with the transition to housing, such as family or friends who can help with tours of properties or pack and unpack for the move. And last but not least, resources from the person or family, such as a special needs trust that can cover certain living expenses, a truck to help with moving, or even contributions of furniture and household supplies. The tenant screening also involves reviewing critical steps to help the person prepare for independent living and uncover housing barriers. Preparing for independent living involves identifying potential housemates, if any, and whether they have agreed to live with the person. Creating a monthly budget for independent living that reflects the person's projected income and expenses in independent housing. Remember, income and expenses in the current living arrangement and the independent living budget may differ. The screening also involves developing a move-in budget that identifies resources to cover initial expenses to move into independent housing, such as application fees, security and utility deposits, moving costs, or needed furniture and household supplies. The tenant screening includes templates for creating independent living and move-in budgets. Lastly, preparing for independent living involves determining what supports and services the person currently has to help him or her obtain housing and maintain tenancy, and what supports and services the person still needs to secure. Commuting housing guides should become familiar with the person's individual service plan, or ISP. The ISP is available in the Waiver Management System, known as WAMS. The ISP details what services and supports the individual receives in many areas of life, and the frequency, duration, and intensity of these services. Uncovering potential barriers to accessing housing involves obtaining required documentation that is missing, such as an original birth certificate, Social Security card, government-issued photo ID, or documentation of income such as benefits, verification letters, or pay stubs. Potential barriers may be documenting any arrests, charges, or convictions the person or any household members have incurred, noting blemishes on the person's or the other household member's rental history, such as non-payment of rent, lease violations, or evictions, and researching any outstanding debts or bankruptcy. The next part of the tenant screening focuses on identifying housing needs. Housing needs are part of what is important for a person in their housing and often relates to health, safety, and accessibility. Questions to ask include, what should the person's housing be close to or far from? For example, a person may need to be close to a job, school, family, shopping, services, and far away from dangerous intersections or people who have been a negative influence in the past. Another question is, what safety and security and accessibility features are critical? For example, does the individual need a secure building entrance, an electric instead of gas stove, a roll-in shower, or maybe wide doorways? And what accommodations will the person need? Examples include approval to pay rent in the middle of the month, a parking space for visiting support staff, or perhaps an emotional support animal. Lastly, what furniture and household supplies does the person already have, and what will the person need? The move-in budget template referenced in the tenant screening also has a furniture and supply inventory that you can use. The last element of the tenant screening consists of reviewing eligibility for different housing resources. Questions to discuss include, is the person in the target population for the housing program being considered? For example, a person with developmental disabilities, older adults, people who are homeless, or veterans. Is the individual's household income eligible? That is the total household income within the program's minimum and or maximum income limits? Does the individual need rental assistance to afford the unit? What about the person's or a housemate's history or background could render him or her ineligible? For example, credit issues, criminal record, or eviction history. What documentation do the person and any housemate still need in order to apply for this resource? And if the program has a wait list, can the person safely remain in current housing until his or her name reaches the top of the list? Now, let's review the key concepts related to conducting a tenancy screening. I'll read the question. We'll have a poll come up live, and we'll ask you to click on the circle next to your answer choice and then hit the button to submit your response. So, question number 1. Conducting a tenant screening includes A, determining where a person wants to live, B, determining with whom a person wants to live, C, determining what kind of building a person wants to live in, D, answers A and B, or E, all of the above. I'll give you a couple seconds here to respond. right, Kim, when you're ready, you can end the poll and let's see what we've got. So the correct answer is E, all of the above. In order to perform the tenant screening, it's important to determine where a person wants to live, with whom he or she wants to live, and what kind of building he or she wants to live in. All right. If you want to hide that poll, Kim, we'll go to the next one. Thanks. Here's question number 2 on tenancy screenings. True or false? Creating an estimated monthly budget for independent living and a move-in budget do not help to determine if a person is financially prepared for independent housing. Is this A, true, or B, false? All right, Kim, when you're ready, you can close that poll. Excellent. Nice job, folks. The correct answer is B, false. Creating an estimated monthly budget for independent living and a move-in budget does help determine if a person is financially prepared for independent housing. All right. Let's do question number 3. Supports in housing should be based on what the person currently receives and what he or she may need to be healthy and safe in housing. Supports should be determined and secured, A, after the person moves into housing, B, before the person moves into housing, or C, when the provider is identified. Take a moment to let you select your answer. All right, Kim, I think we're ready to close the poll. And nice job. Most of you answered B, before the person moves into housing. It's really important to know what supports a person currently receives and what supports a person will need when she or he moves into housing in order to ensure his or her health and safety once they get into independent housing. All right. We're going to take a break here and enable the microphones as well as turning off the recording so that you'll have a chance to take some to the next section. All right. In this next section, we're going to review the key steps in developing a housing roadmap. The purpose of a housing roadmap is to help individuals prepare for independent living. The Community Housing Guide uses the information collected from the tenancy screening to develop the roadmap. Please note that Medicaid does not require community housing guides to complete a housing roadmap, but it is considered an allowable activity and a best practice tool. A link to a housing roadmap template is available in the FAQ for Module 3. Moreover, the Housing Action Plan that is part of the DBHDS Housing Referral Package is an example of a housing roadmap. The support coordinators are responsible for submitting the Housing Action Plan. So upon a support coordinator's request, a community housing guide can complete the Housing Action Plan with the individual and his or her planning team. The components of a housing roadmap include establishing the household composition, that is, who will live with the person, balancing the budget for independent living, securing supports for independent living, addressing the individual's housing needs, including accessibility, affordability, safety and security, loneliness, and location, and overcoming barriers to housing, for example, by requesting a reasonable accommodation if a barrier is disability-related and results in an initial rejection of the housing application. The Community Housing Guide, the individual, and his or her support team must outline key strategies, action steps, and persons responsible for accomplishing each component of the housing plan. Let's look at each component of this map in greater detail. So the first component of a housing roadmap is establishing the household composition. During the tenancy screening, the community housing guide may have learned the individual needs or wants to live with someone. If the individual has not identified this person, then the guide can help the individual develop and implement a plan to secure a housemate or a live-in aide. It's important to explain the difference between a housemate and live-in aide to the individual, and then discuss which role will meet the individual's needs. Let's start with housemates. A housemate lives with the individual and may provide fellowship and socialization. A housemate may contribute toward rent and share certain living expenses, housekeeping chores, and activities. Finally, a housemate is generally not expected to provide routine direct support, such as teaching the person skills, assisting the person with activities of daily living, or performing housekeeping for the person. Now, let's take a look at live-in aides. A live-in aide is a reasonable accommodation that enables an individual with a disability to access and use rent assistance or rental housing. Live-in aides provide essential care and supports for the well-being of the person with a disability. The live-in aide enables the person to live in and use housing. Care and supports may include teaching skills, assisting with activities of daily living, or performing chores or housekeeping. Now, the live-in aide is not obligated for the support of the person with a disability. For example, the aide is not the parent, adoptive parent, or foster parent of a minor with a disability who's obligated to provide the minor care and financial support. Likewise, a live-in aide cannot contribute income to the household, for example, for living expenses. If this occurs, the person is no longer considered a live-in aide, but is a household member whose income must be included when the rental assistance program calculates the tenant's contribution toward rent. Lastly, the live-in aide would not live in the unit except to provide necessary support services. Unlike a spouse or your girlfriend or roommate, the live-in aide would not otherwise have lived with the person. Live-in aides also do not do shift work and then return to their homes. Rather, they live with an individual with a disability. The individual's home is their 24/7 residence. If the individual terminates the live-in aide services, the aide has no rights of occupancy and must leave the unit. Likewise, if the person with a disability moves or passes away, the aide is not entitled to the rent assistance as a remaining member of the household. Live-in aides are considered live-in home care workers under the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. This means live-in aides have certain wage protections in an employment relationship. Different parties could be the employer of a live-in aide depending on the circumstances. These parties include a provider agency, an individual, or the individual's family. Often, there is a joint employment relationship that an individual or family share with a provider agency. If the individual or the individual's family directly engages a live-in aide to perform specific supports, sets the aide's schedule, tells the aide what tasks to do or when to do them, pays the aide or can hire and fire the aide, then the aide is probably employed by the individual or his or her family. For example, take Jack's father, Mark. He finds Carol to live with Jack. Mark asks Carol to prepare Jack meals twice a day, help him with laundry and house cleaning, and assist him with bathing. Mark pays Carol $15 an hour to perform this work. Mark, Jack's dad, is the employer in this instance. Now, if the individual uses the waiver's consumer-directed personal assistance services, then the individual or the family is employing the live-in aide. While individuals who use consumer-directed personal assistance services have a fiscal agent that performs payroll services, the individual or family is still the employer. So let's think back to Jack's situation. If Jack gets consumer-directed personal assistance services, then Mark is still the employer of record because he hires and fires Carol and directs Jack's care. The difference is that a fiscal agent performs payroll. If the individual uses the waiver's agency-directed personal assistance services, then the individual or family and the agency are joint employers. The individual may rely on the agency to pay the live-in aid and keep required employment records. So, if Jack and Mark decide to have Personal Care Plus Incorporated place one of their staff in Jack's house, then Jack and Mark and Personal Care Plus are joint employers. If Personal Care Plus does not pay the staff that lives with Jack, then Jack or Mark may be personally responsible for any wages owed to the live-in staff under the minimum wage and overtime law. Now, the Fair Labor Standards Act has special rules regarding how live-in home care workers are compensated in terms of minimum wage and overtime wages. So for more information on this issue regarding live-in aides and housemates, see the FAQ for Module 3. It's important to know who the employer is if the live-in aide is paid cash wages, because the employer may have to withhold Social Security and Medicare taxes from the paycheck, report wages and file federal tax returns, and pay federal and state unemployment taxes. So again, for more information about employment taxes that apply to live-in aides, see the FAQ for Module 3. Once the individual has decided between a housemate and a live-in aide, the next step is to secure the right person. The Community Housing Guide can refer the individual to his or her support coordinator for shared living services. This Medicaid waiver service assists individuals who are looking to share rental housing with a roommate. In shared living, a provider helps an individual locate a roommate, performs background checks, links the roommate to required training, and assists with the development of a supports agreement. The provider also serves as a fiscal agent and reimburses the individual for a portion of the roommate's housing expenses, including rent, utilities, internet, and food. The roommate is not an employee of the individual and is not compensated for providing supports, but may be employed outside of the shared living arrangement. The roommate in shared living provides basic fellowship and companionship and helps the individual achieve a sense of security inside and outside the residence. The roommate's not responsible for the person's medical or habilitative care, health, welfare, or development. The roommate spends no more than 20% of his or her weekly support time assisting with personal care and routine daily tasks, such as meal prep, light housework, and assistance with taking medications. The roommate's activities with the individual are outlined in a supports agreement. Also, a roommate cannot be the person's parent, step-parent, grandparent, or guardian. If a person does not choose shared living services under the Medicaid waiver, the Community Housing Guide can assist the individual with creating a one-page description that lists great things to know about the individual, what's important to the individual, and what others need to know and do to support the individual, including daily and weekly routines. A sample one-page description is available in the FAQ for Module 3. The Housing Guide can also identify characteristics a housemate or live-in aide should have. These characteristics should be based on the individual's preferences, such as ideal personality traits, the supports the individual needs, and the skills required to provide these supports, and shared interests. Next, the Housing Guide can help the person diagram their circle of support to assess whether there are people he or she already knows who might be willing to be a housemate or a live-in aide. Start with the inner circle and list the most important people in the person's life. So the person goes in the middle, and in that first ring are the most important people in the person's life. Then proceed to the outer circles and list important people in the person's life and other people in the person's life. Include people in each circle as appropriate, such as relatives, such as siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles, friends, co-workers, coaches or teammates from recreation activities, people who taught or supported the individual at school, like teachers or aides, bus drivers, congregation members, former direct support staff. And once potential candidates are identified, assist the individual with approaching people in that circle of support to see if they might be interested in being the individual's housemate or live-in aide. The FAQ for Module 3 has a link to the sample circle of support diagram that you can use. If nobody in the circle of support responds, let's try creating a housemate wanted or live-in caregiver wanted advertisement that describes the individual and the living situation he or she is seeking. Provide a brief overview of the expectations for the housemate or live-in aide and highlight what's being offered to the housemate or live-in aide, such as wages for the live-in aide, free or reduced rent, free or reduced internet and cable, a stipend to transport the individual or take the individual to different activities, or a monthly gift card for groceries. Make sure the individual and family are prepared to make good on any offer they make. And then you want to send the advertisement to those in the circle of support and ask if they know of someone who might be interested. You can also post the advertisement in local coffee shops, grocery stores, libraries. Last but not least, consider searching for caregivers on caregiving websites. Several of these sites are listed in the FAQ for Module 3. Once the individual has identified candidates, the Community Housing Guide can help the individual select at least 2 candidates to interview if possible, screen these candidates based on the list of desired housemate and live-in aide characteristics, and then develop a set of interview questions with the individual based on his or her one-page description. If interviewing someone the individual does not know, be sure to select a neutral public place for the interview and support the individual through the interview process. Ask the top 5 most important questions to the individual. Have the individual and any others conducting the interview rate each candidate's responses on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree with the response and 5 being strongly agree with the response. Take notes on each candidate's responses and calculate an interview score. Add up each interviewer's ratings to get an interview score. For sample interview questions and a sample interview rating form for live-in aides and housemates, see the FAQ for Module 3. Now, before the interview ends, be sure to request 2 to 3 references, preferably from people who were prior housemates or for whom the candidate served as a caregiver. Next, review those interview scores and the notes with the individual to select a finalist. Once a finalist is selected, help the individual screen the finalist's background. Now, screening doesn't guarantee a live-in aide or a housemate is qualified and trustworthy. However, screening can provide a glimpse of the candidate's history and help inform the individual's choice. Screening includes checking the Virginia Sex Offender Registry to verify the candidate does not have a record of committing sex offenses, requesting a state police criminal history check. This will provide Virginia conviction data only. For Virginia arrest or charge data, the candidate must submit a fingerprint card. There's a processing fee. So see the FAQ for Module 3 to get links to the registry and the Virginia State Police criminal record check. Finally, screening includes performing a search on the internet to see if there's any background information about him or her that might raise red flags. Now remember, not everything on the internet is accurate, so look for patterns of similar information across different sources. Next, assist the individual with contacting the finalist's references. Consider asking the reference questions, such as, what were the candidate's role and responsibilities as a housemate or a live-in aide? If interviewing someone the individual does not know, make sure that you've selected a public, neutral place for the interview and support the individual through this process. What did you like about the candidate's work? What did you not like about the candidate's work? For example, did he or she often fail to show up on time to work, fail to follow instructions, or fail to get along with residents or coworkers, or not complete tasks on time or accurately? And last but not least, would you hire the candidate again? So review these references together and decide if any responses raise red flags that should be explored. If not, then help the individual inform the finalist that he or she has been selected. Now, once the finalist is selected, the housing guide can assist the individual with providing an orientation to the housemate or live-in aide. During the orientation, it's important to review the individual's one-page description and answer any questions, to provide a list of important and emergency contacts to that housemate or live-in aide, and to confirm any or negotiate any offers made, such as that free or reduced rent, free or reduced internet cable, stipend to transport the person, or to take the individual to different activities, or monthly gift card for groceries. If the individual has selected a housemate, be sure to discuss who is responsible for different chores. Make a weekly schedule of chores to document who will do what tasks, such as cleaning the bathroom and kitchen, vacuuming, dusting, putting dishes away, purchasing household supplies, etc. A link to a sample chore chart is available in the FAQ for Module 3. Also discuss with the housemate how household expenses will be split, such as rent, utilities, or household supplies, internet cable, etc. If the individual has engaged a live-in aide, then you want to be sure to discuss the schedule of supports to be provided. You can make a weekly calendar that outlines what assistance the aide will provide each day of the week and at different times of the day. A link to a sample supports chart is available in the FAQ for Module 3. Also review the individual's expectations for how different supports will be provided. The aide needs to understand exactly how to assist the individual. For example, does the individual need verbal reminders, verbal instructions, or physical assistance to complete certain tasks? Don't forget to cover how the aide will be paid. Review what the agreed upon wage or stipend is, how often it will be paid, and what documentation the aide must submit to be paid, such as a timesheet. Last but not least, assist the individual with developing an agreement that the individual or the guardian and the housemate or live-in aide both sign. For sample housemate and live-in aide agreements, guess what? See the FAQ for Module 3. So we just covered the first component of the housing roadmap, establishing household composition. The next element of the roadmap is balancing the individual's budget for independent living. If the independent living budget developed during the tenancy screening indicates the individual cannot make ends meet, housing guides can suggest several strategies to help balance the monthly independent living budget. First, the individual can work on increasing income by getting a job, increasing hours worked, or applying for Social Security disability insurance or supplemental security income. Second, the individual can work on reducing discretionary expenses that represent wants rather than needs. For example, an individual might get a cheaper cell phone or cable plan, might reduce expenses for eating out or entertainment, or take public transportation instead of paying for auto insurance, repairs, and gasoline. Third, the individual can secure alternative resources to help offset or eliminate certain expenses by applying for benefits such as SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or fuel assistance, or asking help from family, or even doing laundry at a relative's home. Sometimes, family can directly assist with expenses such as social activities, phones, cable and internet, transportation. Alternately, families can create a special needs trust or an ABLE account to cover these types of expenses. For more information on special needs trusts and ABLE accounts, please see the FAQ for Module 3. Here are a few more strategies to balance the monthly independent living budget. Community housing guides can encourage the individual to consider a housemate that can share expenses such as rent, utilities, food, household supplies, etc. They can ask the individual and the support coordinator to explore benefits planning services that are available through Medicaid waivers for people with developmental disabilities. Individuals who receive any type of Social Security benefits can request benefit planning. Benefit planning includes the option to do a financial health assessment. This tool assesses an individual's understanding of his or her current financial situation. Benefits planning is available in the Building Independence, Family and Individual Supports, and Community Living Waivers. Remember, the Individual Support Coordinator can connect the individual to services and resources that will help the individual implement these budget strategies. So we've reviewed the strategies for balancing the individual's independent living budget. But now let's talk about how to budget for the move into housing. If the move-in budget that the individual developed during the tenancy screening process shows the individual cannot afford the upfront costs to move into housing, community housing guides can suggest strategies, such as using funds from a special needs trust or ABLE account to cover furniture, household supplies, or moving costs, shopping for furniture and household items at thrift stores, and asking family or friends to contribute to security deposits as a gift, donate furniture and household items, or even help with the move instead of using a moving company. Other strategies to balance move-in budgets include asking the individual and the support coordinator to explore transitional services and flexible funding. Individuals can request transition services if they are transitioning from an institution or a licensed provider-operated living arrangement to a living arrangement in the private residence, where the person is directly responsible for his or her own living expenses. This service is available in all 3 Medicaid waivers for people with developmental disabilities. The transition services provider pays the vendor directly for the goods or services, and DMAS, our Medicaid agency, reimburses the provider. Transition services are available for 1 transition per individual and must be expended within 9 months from the service authorization date. Total allowable costs can't exceed $5,000, but they can include and are not limited to security deposits to lease an apartment or home, essential household furnishings to occupy a home, such as furniture, window coverings, household items to prepare food, bed, and bath linens. It also includes setup fees or deposits for utilities, moving expenses, and fees to obtain required documentation to lease housing, like that birth certificate or photo ID we talked about. Likewise, individuals who are transitioning from their family's home, an institution, or a licensed setting to a residence where the person leases the unit can request flexible funding to help with upfront expenses for the person's first move to independent housing, which would otherwise pose a barrier to making this transition. Eligible applicants must be moving into independent housing and must either have a Medicaid DD Waiver or be on the DD Waiver waitlist. Flexible funding is administered by community services boards that the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services has designated as flexible funding administrators. Allowable costs for flexible funding are similar to those covered in waiver transition services and cannot exceed $5,000. The flexible funding administrators pay for upfront housing costs by purchasing goods and services on the individual's behalf and or reimbursing the individual or their family if they pay for approved goods and services. Now, please note that flexible funding does not advance funding to individuals. The individual support coordinator helps the individual complete an application and submits it to the administrator for approval. For more information about flexible funding, see the FAQ for Module 3. We've covered the first 2 parts of the housing roadmap, establishing household composition and balancing the budget for independent living, and the initial transition to housing. Now let's cover the third component, securing needed supports for independent living. The tenancy screening revealed the supports the person already has in place to obtain and maintain housing, and the supports that are not yet in place, but are essential to obtain and maintain housing. Here are some strategies housing guides can employ to help the individual access needed supports. First, talk with the individual about the services and supports the 3 Virginia Medicaid DD waivers offer to help people live independently. Again, those 3 waivers are the Building Independence Waiver, the Family and Individual Supports Waiver, and the Community Living Waiver. Examples of waiver services that people can access to support independent living include personal assistance services, in-home support services, shared living, independent living supports, companion services, personal emergency response systems, assistive technology, environmental modifications, and electronic home-based services. Please see that FAQ for Module 3 to review a list of service definitions and the service options available in each waiver. Next, housing guides want to identify any non-waiver supports the individual may need to obtain and maintain housing, such as a representative payee to help manage supplemental security or Social Security benefits, or a substitute decision maker who can legally enter into contracts like a lease, such as a durable power of attorney or a guardian. Talk to the individual about the waiver and non-waiver supports that may be important to and important for him or her. If the individual agrees to pursue any of these supports, arrange a time to discuss the needed waiver and non-waiver supports with the support coordinator. Share recommendations for new waiver services or changes in the level of existing services, and ask the support coordinator to revise the individual service plan and link that individual to needed services and support. If you have a sense of the individual's needs, but you're not sure what waiver or non-waiver supports may address these needs, consult the individual support coordinator. You can also get technical assistance from the regional housing coordinator or community resource consultant that works for the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. The next element of the housing roadmap is developing strategies to address housing needs. Basic housing needs can include, but they're not limited to, affordability, accessibility, safety and security, location, and social integration. Let's look at each of these in turn, starting with affordability. Housing is generally considered affordable when a household spends no more than 30 to 40% of their monthly income on rent and utilities. Households may be at risk of eviction if they pay more than this, and later experience a decrease in income or an increase in expenses. If most properties in the area where a person wants to live have rents plus tenant-paid utilities that exceed 30 to 40% of monthly household income, the person has a few choices. The person can look for housing in a lower cost area, consider finding one or more roommates to split the rent and utilities, or apply for the rent assistance where available using the resources we just covered in Module 2. Next, let's examine strategies to address accessibility needs in housing. Individuals who have visual, hearing, mobility, or physical limitations often find it difficult to use units that are not designed and built to fair housing accessibility guidelines or more stringent accessible design and construction standards. Finding barrier-free housing units in some communities can be like searching for a needle in a haystack. So here are some tips to address this challenge. First, search for accessible housing using websites that list properties and units with accessible features. Then get individuals on wait lists for properties that have accessible units and help them apply for resources that can assist with the cost of making accessibility modifications. There are 3 major resources to consider: environmental modification services in the Medicaid DD waivers, flexible funding, and Virginia Housing Development Authority's Rental Unit Accessibility Modification Program. For links to Housing Search websites and details on these funding sources for accessibility modifications, please see the FAQ for Module 3. Safety and security are critical housing needs. Some individuals need certain supports to minimize the risk of injury or exploitation when living on their own. Here are some strategies housing guides can use to improve safety and security for these individuals. They can complete a home safety checklist that identifies critical features a unit must have to address the safety needs for individuals with disabilities. A sample safety checklist is in the FAQ for Module 3. They can explore assistive technology and electronic home-based monitoring equipment funded through the Medicaid DD waivers. For example, did you know there are video cameras that can notify a family member when a visitor is at the person's front door? Or there are tablets with video communication apps to check in remotely with the individual. And there are devices that remind individuals to take medications, turn off the stove, and lock the door. Other safety strategies include identifying neighbors who can check in on the individual a few days a week and contact the family or support coordinator if there's a concern. Seeking properties with on-site property management and secure entry systems such as keypads or fobs can also help. Housing guides can find a housemate who can provide informal support such as helping the individual answer the phone and the door or be available in case of an emergency to guide the person to safety. And last but not least, we can look at engaging a live-in aide who can provide essential care and supports for individuals who have health and safety needs, such as managing seizures, diabetic reactions, panic attacks, disorientation, or providing physical assistance to use the bathroom or prepare meals and exit the unit in an emergency. A live-in aide can be funded using agency or consumer-directed personal assistance services in the Medicaid Family and Individual Support or Community Living waivers. Now let's examine location as a key housing need. Some individuals have to live in specific locations because they need ready access to certain destinations, such as a job, school, medical care services, or family who provide natural supports. Others need to be on a regular or accessible public transportation route so they can get to these key destinations. Community housing guides can address housing location needs during the housing search by determining the maximum distance that the individual can walk to reach a bus, trolley, or light rail stop, and identifying properties that have transportation stops within this maximum distance. Alternately, community housing guides can obtain copies of major public transportation routes and stops and identify rental properties and key destinations within walking distance of those stops. If public transportation is limited, get an estimated price for on-demand transportation, such as taxi or some of our newer on-demand transportation services, from rental properties of interest to key locations. Then estimate the number of trips taken each month and determine whether the monthly cost of on-demand transportation is within the individual's budget. Community housing guides can link individuals to their support coordinators to access waiver-funded employment and community transportation services. This waiver service pays for cost of public transportation or community drivers who provide individuals rides to employment and community activities. Last but not least, community housing guides can also suggest using funds from a special needs trust or enable account to pay a housemate or live-in aide a stipend to drive the individual to important events and activities. Information about employment and community transportation services, special needs trust enable accounts are available in the FAQ for Module 3. The last housing need we will address is social integration. Individuals who have limited circles of support and social networks can be at risk of social isolation when they move into independent housing. Here are some strategies community housing guides can suggest to improve social integration and connections to others. First, they can explore assistive technology options in the Medicaid waiver to help individuals connect with friends and family on a routine basis. For example, They can use a video conferencing app available on laptops, tablets, or smartphones. Next, investigate companion services that are available through Medicaid's Family and Individual Support Waiver and Community Living Waiver. A companion can provide socialization, non-medical care, and support to an individual at home and in the community. Third, you could examine whether the individual knows someone who could be a housemate that provides fellowship and socialization. The waiver shared living service can be used to reimburse the individual for a portion of the housemate's rent, utilities, internet, and food. And lastly, consider whether the individual could benefit from an emotional support animal. The individual must be able to afford animal care expenses and provide daily care, or have a support person who can assist with the daily care of the animal. If the property the individual plans to move into does not permit pets, you may need to help the individual request a reasonable accommodation to their pet policy. We're going to take a little break here, as was requested in our last module, so that you can get up and stretch and take a quick break, grab a snack, anything you'd like. We'll be back in about 5 minutes. All right, so we are back and we're still developing our housing roadmap, and we're on the last component of the roadmap, and that's developing a plan to address housing barriers. So housing barriers are circumstances that prevent individuals from accessing rent assistance and rental housing. Barriers can include, but are not limited to, lack of required documentation, criminal history, a poor rental history, outstanding debts, and a lack of credit. Let's look at strategies to address each of these areas. So first, we're going to look at strategies to address required documentation that the tenancy screening indicates the individual needs, like birth certificates, social security number verification, valid photo identification, verification of disability income, and proof of earned income. These are the documents typically needed to apply for rental assistance and for rental housing. In general, the most efficient way to obtain missing birth certificates, social security cards, and valid photo identification is to see if a family member or support coordinator can obtain the original documents. If neither family nor the support coordinator can assist, then you'll have to help the individual request documentation from the appropriate issuing agency. You can check out the FAQ for Module 3, and it has links to issuing agencies and the specific processes to obtain each of these documents. Similarly, if an individual doesn't have the most recent benefit verification letter for supplemental security income or income verification letter for Social Security disability income, it will be necessary to contact the Social Security Administration. These letters can be requested electronically if the individual has an online account with the Social Security Administration. Again, see the FAQ for Module 3 for a link to the Social Security Administration webpage that describes how to make online requests. If the individual receives employment income, help the individual contact all current employers for copies of the most recent pay stubs or a letter verifying wages received. It's a good idea to get pay stubs or a verification letter that covers wages earned in the most recent 3 months. Now let's turn to strategies to address housing barriers such as prior arrests, charges, or convictions that may interfere with accessing rental assistance or rental housing. Here are some strategies to address those issues. First, assist the individual with obtaining a copy of their criminal record. For records of criminal activity that occurred in Virginia, use the same resources we discussed when requesting a criminal record for a live-in aide or a roommate. Next, determine the nature of the offense or offenses. Confirm whether the offense resulted in a conviction and is one of the 3 offenses that will typically exclude an individual from participating in a rental assistance program. That is, does the conviction require registration on the Lifetime Sex Offender Registry? Was the person convicted for drug-related criminal activity for the production or manufacture of methamphetamine on the premises of federally assisted housing? Or was the conviction for engaging in the illegal use of drugs? Make sure you identify how long ago the offenses occurred. because many rental assistance programs and rental properties use what we call look-back periods to decide whether an offense should be considered. If the offense is outside of the look-back period, it may not affect the person's eligibility. Finally, examine whether the offenses were directly related to the individual's disability. If yes, then you want to explore making a reasonable accommodation request to mitigate the impact of the criminal history on program or property eligibility. It will be important to explain what services and supports have been put in place to minimize the likelihood of the offenses reoccurring, and to gather supporting documentation of completion and or participation in interventions such as substance abuse programs, counseling, support groups, skills training, or even driver education. Next, let's look at the strategies to address the barrier around poor rental history. So a poor rental history might include lease violations, evictions, judgments, or non-renewals of leases. If the tenancy screening revealed any of these circumstances, consider the following strategies. You could assist the individual with obtaining a copy of their credit report from www.annualcreditreport.com. This site is sponsored by the Consumer Protection Bureau and gives individuals access to 3 free credit reports per year. Determine whether the report shows non-payment of rent, damages, or utilities which result in collections action or a judgment. In Virginia, a judgment can remain on an individual's credit record for 10 years or more. A debt in collections can remain on a credit record for 6 years. If there is a judgment or debt in collections that will not be removed from the credit record for many years, it makes sense to determine whether there are resources to pay off the judgment or the debt. Ask if the individual has savings, family resources, a special needs trust or ABLE account that could help cover the payment. If not, flexible funding may also be able to assist. We'll talk more about strategies for paying off judgments and debts a little later. So next, you want to determine how long ago any lease violations or evictions occurred. Lease violations and evictions typically don't show up on credit reports, so you'll need to ask the individual to supply this information or to sign a release so you can contact prior landlords for this information. If the individual is currently renting and the lease violation is remediable or the eviction can be redeemed, develop and implement a plan with the individual to immediately cure the violation or pay all amounts owed to the landlord or court to stop the eviction. If the lease violation or eviction occurred in a prior rental, you may have to look at options such as offering a higher security deposit to the next landlord, which shouldn't exceed 2 months' rent, finding someone to be a guarantor or co-sign the lease for the individual, or focusing the housing search on properties that have less stringent tenant selection criteria. Smaller rental properties, properties owned or managed by nonprofit housing providers, or units that are for rent by individual owners may be an option in this case. You'll want to assess whether the lease violation or eviction was directly related to the individual's disability. If yes, then plan to make a reasonable accommodation request to overlook the violation. In the request, identify the services and supports in place to minimize the likelihood of the violation or eviction reoccurring. Also gather supporting documentation that shows completion and or participation in interventions that mitigate the violation or the eviction, such as renter education, skills training, or residential programs. If violations or evictions are due to issues such as poor housekeeping, late or unpaid rent, unauthorized occupants, or damages to the unit, consider recommending Medicaid waiver services that could support the individual to comply with the lease obligations, such as independent living supports for people who have a building independence waiver, in-home supports for people who have a family and individual support waiver or a community living waiver, or personal assistance for people who have a family and individual support waiver or community living waiver. See the FAQ for Module 3 for links to descriptions to all of these services. Individuals may also need non-waiver supports to help them comply with lease obligations, such as a representative payee for Social Security benefits, a substitute decision maker, such as a durable power of attorney or guardian, or a relative that can co-sign the lease or guarantee the rent. Finally, it is important to assess whether anyone in the individual circle of support can provide positive character references that would offset a landlord's concerns about rental history. These could include prior landlords, employers, service providers, and congregation leaders. The next housing barrier we'll examine is debts and bankruptcy. Here are the strategies to help individuals who have outstanding debts or bankruptcy. Housing guides can assist the individual with obtaining a credit report from annualcreditreport.com. They can determine whether the personal information and debts listed on the credit report are accurate. If they're not, follow the credit agency's process for disputing the inaccurate information and correcting the credit record. If it appears the individual is a victim of identity theft, assist the individual with filing a police report. If the debt listed on the individual's credit report is accurate, create a plan with the individual to work on reducing and clearing up the debt. Focus on eliminating housing-related debts first, such as unpaid rent or utilities. Housing guides can also identify opportunities to negotiate reduction and repayment of debts. Remember, a debt can remain on a credit record for 6 years in Virginia. So if the 6-year statute of limitations is nearly over, it might not be worth repaying it. However, if it's going to take several years before the debt is removed from the credit record and the individual needs to be housed immediately, consider contacting the property or the collections agency and asking them to forgive interest charges or to forgive a portion of the amount owed if the remainder is paid in full. It is also possible to negotiate paying a certain amount each month, but the debt will not be fulfilled and removed from the credit record until it is paid in full. Again, ask if the individual has savings, family resources, a special needs trust or ABLE account that could help cover the payment. If not, flexible funding may also be able to assist. Finally, it may be helpful to ask the individual if the individual has a relative or friend that could co-sign the lease agreement or serve as a guarantor if landlords require this to approve a rental application. The last housing barrier we'll cover is how to address a lack of credit. Some individuals have never established a credit history because they do not pay routine bills for utilities, rent, phone, or make loan repayments for auto, student, or mortgage loans. Their credit is not damaged, but they have no way to demonstrate that they have a history of making timely, accurate payments of debt. Rental properties may have application criteria that exclude people with no verifiable positive bill or loan payment history. In these cases, it's important to implement proactive strategies, such as putting a utility bill in the individual's name and ensuring it's paid, adding the individual as an authorized user on a trusted family member's credit card, asking for a reasonable accommodation to provide alternative evidence of positive bill paying history, such as receipts from a service provider or a doctor to whom regular fees are paid. And the housing guide can ask if the individual has a relative or friend that could co-sign the lease agreement or serve as a guarantor if it's needed. Housing providers generally require co-signers or guarantors to have an excellent credit history and sufficient income to cover their own housing costs plus the housing costs of the individual. All right, we have hit our knowledge check. So let's review the key concepts for developing a housing roadmap. Again, we're going to put up some polling questions here. We ask you to click on the answer that best represents your response. So question 1 is, which is not a component of the housing roadmap? A, establishing the household composition. B, balancing the budget for independent living. C, successfully performing all skills needed for independent living. Or D, addressing the individual's housing needs. take a moment to click on your answer. Kim, I think we're ready to close the poll. All right. Everybody who responded did get it correct. The correct answer is C, successfully performing all skills needed for independent living. Individuals don't have to demonstrate they can perform all independent living skills before moving to their own home. Rather, they may have to secure any supports they may need to obtain and maintain their housing. Other steps on the housing roadmap include establishing household composition, balancing the budget for independent living, addressing individual housing needs, and overcoming barriers to housing. Now let's look at question 2. Which strategy below will not make an independent living budget work? A, increasing income. B, reducing expenses. C, securing alternative resources to offset expenses. D, applying for a loan. Or E, living with a housemate. All right, Tim, whenever you're ready. Okay. All of our respondents answered D, applying for a loan. And that is correct. A loan has to be paid back, often with interest, which will further burden the individual's budget. So instead, community housing guides can help individuals find ways to increase their income, reduce their expenses, secure alternative resources to offset expenses, or suggest living with a housemate who can share certain expenses. All right, so we're going to take another break here, this time to open the mics and give you a moment to comment on the section that's regarding the housing roadmap in your feedback form. So we'll pause, resume our recording here. And next, we're going to turn to supports to obtain housing. So we've covered how to conduct a tenant screening and how to develop a housing roadmap. In this next section, we're going to discuss the routine day-to-day supports that community housing guides provide to assist individuals with obtaining housing. We'll examine the activities the housing guides do to help individuals access rental assistance and rental housing. So community housing guides assist individuals with accessing rent assistance. This is a major part of their work. The community housing guide helps the individual prepare and submit the rental assistance application and supporting documentation. The guide helps attend the eligibility interview and the briefing when rent assistance is awarded, and explains important issues to the individual and advocates on the individual's behalf. And finally, the guide helps the individual request reasonable accommodations and gather needed documentation to support that request. So that's how housing guides help with accessing rent assistance. But housing guides also assist individuals with accessing the rental housing itself by locating properties that accept rent assistance, educating landlords about rent assistance, addressing criminal and credit issues with the landlords during the application process, negotiating security deposits, linking individuals to resources that cover upfront housing costs, establishing effective landlord-tenant communication, requesting, again, reasonable accommodations and modifications, and coordinating that transition to housing. So let's look at these activities in a little more detail. First, let's look at tips to help community housing guides locate properties that accept rent assistance. Instead of taking a scattershot approach and calling every property in the community, consider a more targeted approach that involves the following steps. Start by contacting the local public housing agency and ask for a list of properties that accept rent assistance in your community. Next, find the low-income housing tax credit properties in the area. Tax credit properties typically accept tenant-based rent assistance such as housing choice vouchers. You can see the FAQ for Module 3 for a link to a list of tax credit properties throughout Virginia. If you're looking for properties that accept rent assistance and have immediate openings, there are several websites that you can visit that have housing search tools. See that FAQ for Module 3 for a list of these websites. Housing guides consider joining or forming local networking groups that exchange information about properties that accept rent assistance. These groups include networks of community housing guides, housing locators, or other housing service providers. The local homeless continuum of care may have such groups. Some communities have property management associations that you can contact to see what properties may accept rent assistance. And finally, if there's a limited number of rental properties in the area, investigate for rent-by-owner options. If educated about rent assistance, individual owners may consider participating. Some individual owners also have less restrictive tenant selection criteria. Some communities have very few landlords that accept rent assistance, so community housing guides will need to build relationships with landlords to create a pool of potential properties which they can refer individuals to. So here's some tips to cultivate relationships with landlords. First, landlord relationships can happen anytime and any place. So be ready and open to new landlord relationships, even if you don't have an individual looking at that particular property. Also visit properties in person. Don't rely solely on calling leasing offices. Visiting properties with individuals and meeting the property management staff can be essential in forming relationships. Help property management get to know that applicant or tenant. Use person-centered descriptions to introduce individuals and encourage individuals to express what they like about the property and what they need to make this housing work for them. Make it personal. Explain to landlords that although the people you assist may have had some problems in their past, they're working hard to improve their circumstances. For some, this may be their first opportunity to live in their own place, and for others, it's helping them get out of the cold or return from the hospital. This is an opportunity to improve the quality of life for fellow community members. Provide responsive support to landlords. That is, return landlords' calls in a timely manner and work to get them the information they need. Build trust and confidence with landlords so they know they have someone they can help problem solve tricky situations that may arise. And last, check in with landlords. Don't wait for those issues to arise. Call the landlord periodically, especially during the first several months of occupancy, just to check in and see how things are going. In addition to building relationships with landlords, community housing guides must often educate landlords about rental assistance. So develop an educational strategy that stresses the benefits of rent assistance to landlords, focuses on the risk reduction elements, and explains the main participation requirements. Major benefits of rental assistance for landlords include guaranteed monthly income, timely rental payments, and less unit turnover. Once participants find a property that works for them and that takes rental assistance, they're pretty likely to stay. Landlords mitigate risks when they rent to individuals with developmental disabilities who receive rent assistance because individuals are typically pre-screened to verify they have the needed documents, supports, and a sustainable budget, and they have access to tenant education, support services, emergency assistance for temporary rent or utilities, and case management support. These services, supports, and resources help residents with developmental disabilities pay their rent on time, keep units in good condition, maintain positive relationships with neighbors and with the landlord. Long-term tenants help landlords reduce their unit turnover and vacancy costs. Lastly, the key requirements for landlords to participate in rental assistance include completing documentation to verify the rent and utilities are in the program's maximum subsidy limit, submitting a W-9 form so the program can report the rent subsidy income to the IRS, getting the unit inspected to ensure it meets basic health and safety standards, entering into a contract with the program that stipulates how, when, and how much the landlord will be paid, and the rules the landlord must follow to continue being paid, and informing the program if the tenant violates the lease or submits a notice to vacate. When educating landlords, it's also important to explain your role as a community housing guide and your agency's history of successes and accomplishments. For example, what populations do you serve? What kinds of meaningful activities are the individuals you serve involved in, such as jobs, school, volunteering, things like that? What support do you offer partnering landlords and management companies, such as renter education, troubleshooting lease compliance issues in the first several months of tenancy, and providing assistance with income recertification? Will your agency co-sign leases or help find co-signers? And finally, give some statistics. Pat yourself on the back. How many individuals have you successfully helped lease units? And of these, how many have been renting for a year or more? In addition to locating properties, cultivating landlord relationships, and educating landlords about rental assistance, community housing guides work with landlords to address applicants' criminal and credit issues. Before assisting individuals with completing rental applications, ask the landlord what the tenant selection criteria are. Some landlords have strict criteria around minimum income, credit, rental history, and criminal history. Most landlords will not budge on a minimum income requirement. However, with the individual's permission, you can speak frankly with the landlord about the individual's credit, rental, and criminal history. Here are some tips for addressing criminal and credit issues with landlords in the application process. First, listen to the landlord's concerns and acknowledge the landlord is responsible for the safety and welfare of all tenants. Explain that community housing guide services, along with case management and other support services, can help mitigate the risks associated with renting to a person who has criminal or credit issues. Explain what assistance you offer during the transition and post-tenancy to help individuals attain and maintain housing stability. Be aware the landlords cannot have blanket selection criteria for criminal backgrounds because this could have a disparate impact on certain classes covered by the Fair Housing Act. Ask the landlord whether the individual's offense bears any relationship to what sort of a tenant the individual might be, the safety of other residents, or the condition of the property. Present any evidence of rehabilitation and highlight any past instances in which the applicant demonstrated a positive rental history. If the offense does have a relationship to the kind of tenant the individual might be, for example, an offense that injured a person or damaged property, then with the individual's consent, explain what steps he or she has taken since committing the offense to minimize the likelihood this behavior will happen again. Here's some additional tips to address criminal and credit issues that arise during the application process. First, provide landlords character letters from trusted or respected third parties or advocacy letters explaining past rental, credit, or criminal problems and what the individual has done to take ownership and address these problems. Next, ask if the landlord will permit applicants with certain types of criminal or credit issues to rent if they have a guarantor or cosigner on the lease who will cover any unpaid rent, damages, or other fees. The individual must have someone who is willing to serve in this capacity and who would meet the landlord's income and credit criteria. Likewise, ask the landlord if the landlord will permit the applicant to rent if the applicant pays a higher security deposit. Now remember, security deposits legally cannot exceed the equivalent of 2 months' rent. The individual must have access to funds to cover a larger security deposit for this to be an option. Finally, if the landlord rejects the individual's rental application on the basis of criminal or credit issues related to the individual's disability, ask for a reasonable accommodation to make an exception to the landlord's applicant screening process. For example, if the individual has a medical debt for treatment of a disability condition, request that these debts be excluded from the credit screening. Sometimes community housing guides must assist individuals with limited resources to negotiate payment of security deposits in order to access rental housing. Try discussing the following options with the individual first to see if any of these approaches are feasible. Then propose an option to the landlord. First, can the individual break up security deposits into several monthly installments? If installments are not feasible, can flexible funding or waiver transition services pay the security deposit? Note that if these sources cannot pay immediately, it may be necessary for the funding source to provide the landlord written confirmation that the individual has been approved for funding, or to issue the landlord a written promise to pay. Community housing guides frequently help individuals access rental housing by linking them to different resources that help cover upfront costs associated with transitioning to rental housing. Here's a snapshot of resources community housing guides should have at their fingertips. Medicaid waiver transition services and flexible funding can cover upfront costs, such as housing application fees, holding fees, security deposits, utility deposits, connection fees, and moving costs. Each region has unique community resources that may be able to cover upfront costs. These resources are very limited and tend to be available for people who are in housing crises. Community housing guides can research what's available locally through congregations, civic groups such as the Rotary, Kiwanis, Elk, Moose, or Optimist clubs, community action agencies, 211 Virginia, and HUD-certified counseling agencies. The FAQ for Module 3 has links to some of these resources so that you can explore them. Throughout the rental housing process, from application to tenancy, individuals may request reasonable accommodations to a landlord's policies or reasonable modifications to a unit or building where they are approved to rent. The Community Housing Guide is responsible for assisting individuals with preparing and submitting requests for reasonable accommodations and modifications. If you need a refresher on examples of reasonable accommodations or modifications that people with disabilities may need in housing, or how to prepare a request to a landlord, see Module 2. It's also critical to establish an effective approach to ongoing landlord and tenant communications, especially when the tenant may need support to read, understand, and respond to important notices from the landlord. One approach is to identify a trusted third-party contact with the individual. This contact could be a family member, guardian, support coordinator, or service provider. Then, help the individual write a letter requesting the landlord send this third-party contact a copy of all notices to the tenant. This contact person can help the individual respond appropriately and in a timely manner. Finally, community housing guides assist individuals with many practical tasks in making the transition to rental housing, including reviewing the lease with the individual to ensure the information is accurate and there are no onerous terms that could put the tenancy at risk, performing housing inspections. Now, there might be two housing inspections, a safety inspection by the rental assistance program and a move inspection by the landlord. The community housing guide is likely to be involved in the moving inspection and can help the individual document damages in writing and with date-stamped photographs and make repair requests that are needed. Community housing guides also help individuals arrange their move, including assisting with securing a moving company or a truck, packing, transferring mail, notifying the phone or cable or internet companies of the new billing address, and transferring medications to pharmacy near the person's home. Guides can help individuals set up utilities and renter's insurance and notify police, fire, and rescue of a new resident who has health or mobility needs if the individual or the guardian desires. Finally, guides can help individuals create a housing file that contains important documents such as rental assistance agreements, the lease, the renter's insurance policy, and the move-in inspection and photos. It can also help individuals develop an emergency contact list and post it in a prominent place in the unit, such as the refrigerator. All right, let's review the key concepts for supports to obtain housing. So Kim's going to put the questions up here, and we'll do our answers the same way. The most efficient, effective way to identify properties in the community that accept rental assistance is to contact each property individually. Is this A, true, B, false? All right, Kim, I think we're ready to close the poll. Looks like we got a split decision here. But the correct answer is actually B, false. So when community housing guides need to quickly identify properties in a community that accept rental assistance, it makes more sense to use a focused approach rather than a scattershot approach. So try exploring low-income housing tax credit properties, properties on the local public housing agency's list of participating landlords, and properties on housing search websites. You could also contact property management associations and networking groups that are aware of properties that take rental assistance. Now, once you've winnowed down your list, then it's a good idea to go visit those properties individually with the person. All right, let's look at question number 2 for supports. Question number 2 is, which approach is not recommended when addressing criminal or credit issues with landlords? A, do not discuss criminal or credit issues at all during the application process. B, discuss whether the criminal record can actually predict what sort of tenant the individual might be. C, explain steps the individual has taken since the offense occurred to minimize the chance of a recurrence. Or D, provide character reference letters that explain how the individual has addressed past rental, credit, or criminal problems. Remember, we're looking for the approach that is not recommended. Thanks, Kim. All right. So the correct answer is A. Do not bring up criminal or credit issues at all during the application process. In fact, when assisting individuals with completing rental applications, community housing guides should ask the landlord what the tenant selection criteria are. It may be possible, with the individual's permission, to speak frankly with the landlord about the individual's credit, rental, and criminal history, its impact on the application, and what the individual has done to address these issues. All right, now let's take a quick break, and we'd like to open the microphones again to get your feedback on this section regarding supports to obtain housing. All right, this last section of the module will discuss the supports that community housing guides provide to help individuals maintain their tenancy. Community housing guides can provide time-limited supports to maintain tenancy during the service authorization period, including training in being a good tenant and lease compliance, support with activities related to household management, resolving conflicts with landlords and neighbors, and assisting with housing recertifications upon request. We'll look at each of these in more detail, However, it's important to remember that if individuals need supports on a longer-term basis beyond the service authorization period, the Community Housing Guide can collaborate with the family, support coordinator, and service providers to transition these supports. So once an individual has moved into a new home, the Community Housing Guide can help the individual learn to be a good tenant and comply with the terms of the lease. Here are some important activities that may be a part of this training. Guides can have the individual ask property management for permission to give a second unit key to a trusted family member or a service provider. This will help prevent lockouts that could result in some significant charges to the individual. Next, housing guides can review any lease provisions or property rules that restrict how tenants can furnish and decorate their units with the individual. Pay particular attention to requirements related to covering hardwood floors, making holes in walls to hang pictures, and prohibitions against certain furnishings like large fish tanks or water beds. If needed, teach the individual how to use and care for appliances, smoke detectors, and heating or cooling systems. They may also need to learn to perform preventive maintenance, such as changing air filters or batteries in smoke detectors. Some individuals may need guidance on how to request repairs. Next, orient the individual to different areas of the building and explain any rules or procedures to access these areas. For example, a building may have a property management office, mail room, laundry room, community room, storage area, or garage, among other facilities. So show the individual where these areas are located and introduce the individual to staff who provide access to these areas. Some areas may require advance approval for residents to use them. So find out what the rules are and how to get permission. Some areas may require the individual to have another key, fob, or card to access them, such as a mailbox or a storage unit. If so, explain how to use these devices to gain access to these areas. Now that the person is in housing, take time to review and adjust the independent living budget you created during the tenancy screening. After a month or two, individuals will have a much better sense of certain costs. You may need to help them tweak their budgets to make sure their income can cover all expenses. Moreover, if the budget's tight, it might be necessary to ask the support coordinator to refer the individual to alternative resources, such as energy assistance, Medicaid Lifeline phones, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, food banks, or subsidized transportation. In addition to budgeting, consider setting up systems to ensure rent and utilities are paid on time and in full. A payment system reduces the chances that an individual will forget to make a payment or be unable to make a payment if indisposed. Some properties and utility companies allow individuals to have rent and utility bills paid automatically from their bank accounts. Likewise, some banks permit account holders to set up regular electronic payments from a bank account to a landlord or a utility company. However, individuals must have sufficient funds in their accounts to make payments, or they could incur additional charges from the landlord or the bank. Some individuals who have difficulty managing their own funds may need assistance from a service provider, such as an independent living supports provider in the BI waiver, or an in-home support provider in the family and individual support or community living waivers. Other individuals who get Social Security benefits may need a representative payee. Finally, community housing guides should review any restrictions on noise, pets, and guests. For example, work with the individual and neighbors to decide on a volume level for electronics that's acceptable to all parties. If pets are allowed, discuss the proper way to have a pet approved. And if there are restrictions on how long guests can stay, make sure the individual understands these limits and what could happen if he or she breaks the rules. Another tenancy support community housing guides provide is assistance with household management activities. Household management activities can include tasks such as budgeting, bill paying, housekeeping, and requesting repairs. We address many household management activities under good tenant training and lease compliance. So let's focus on how to assess whether individuals are successfully performing these activities, and if they're not, what the community housing guide can do. After an individual moves into independent housing, the community housing guide should contact the landlord monthly for several months to confirm whether the individual is paying rent and utilities on time and in full. Community housing guides may also check in with the landlord to learn whether there have been any reports of unusual events on the property, damage to the unit, disturbance by other tenants, safety concerns, unauthorized occupants, or lease violations. If the landlord identifies any of these issues, the community housing guide can follow up with the individual to discern what caused the issue and take appropriate action, including re-examining the budget and system for paying rent and utilities, developing a plan to remedy lease violations, resolving conflicts with neighbors, reporting repairs or safety issues to the landlord, and linking the individual to other services or resources as appropriate. Ask if the individual is having difficulty with certain tasks and if he or she may need additional instruction on how to complete specific household activities or some ongoing assistance to perform these activities. If the individual is open to skills training or assistance, suggest a meeting with the support coordinator to identify services and supports that may be put in place, such as independent living supports if on the BI waiver, or for those in the family individual supports or community living waiver, consider in-home supports or personal assistance. In addition, the community housing guide should perform several home visits to assess how well the individual is maintaining his or her housing. During these visits, conduct a visual inspection of the unit. Here's what you can look for. Damage to the unit or repairs needed, like water leaks, appliances not working. Foul odors, for example, from rotten food, a gas leak, pet or rodent waste, mold, or even unwashed sheets or clothing. Also look for signs of mold or mildew, and for safety risks, such as no battery in the smoke detector, outlets with multiple cords, rips or tears in the carpet, dryer vents or furnace filters that have not been cleaned, or a cluttered HVAC closet. Keep an eye out for signs of unauthorized occupants, such as an extra bed or shoes and clothes that don't belong to the individual. Look for pest risks, such as dirty dishes piled up, trash not properly disposed of, floors not swept or cleaned. And finally, check whether the individual lacks food, cleaning, or personal care supplies. If there's evidence of any of these issues, share your observations with the individual and explain what could happen if these issues aren't addressed. Again, ask if the individual is having difficulty with certain tasks and if he or she may need additional instruction on how to complete specific household activities or just some ongoing assistance to perform these activities. If the individual is open to skills training or assistance, suggest a meeting with the support coordinator to identify waiver services and supports that may be put in place. Resolving conflicts with the landlords, owners, and neighbors is a critical element of helping individuals maintain their tenancy. Here, community housing guides can help individuals identify stressors that may impact tenancy, such as a lack of funds to cover rent, incomplete repairs, pests, or even nighttime noise from neighbors. Guides can help identify changes in behavior of the individual that may trigger conflict. For example, has the individual switched medications or experienced a personal loss that's affecting mood, initiative, or responsiveness? Guides can do a checklist or questionnaire that identifies risks to housing stability and changes needed. The FAQ in Module 3 has a link to a sample independent housing monitoring tool. Guides can bring individual support coordinator and service providers together to identify changes to support services that can address the issues that are causing the conflict. For example, does the individual need a behavioral consultation or increased hours of in-home supports to practice social interactions with neighbors? Guides can coordinate with non-waiver providers and community resources too to help with conflict resolution. For example, guides can suggest accessing anger management classes, engaging a mental health therapist, or even consulting a local landlord-tenant commission. Finally, guides can work with the individual and his or her support team to create a housing crisis prevention plan with strategies to address potential housing crises, such as loss of income to pay rent or other critical expenses, like utilities, food, and medicine, addressing a landlord notice of a lease non-renewal, or what to do if the individual is temporarily displaced from the unit due to damage or flooding. Lastly, when it comes to conflicts, community housing guides must remain neutral and work to solve problems with landlords and neighbors efficiently and effectively. It's important to have expectations for landlords, such as routine maintenance, prompt repairs, and courteous service. It's also important to have expectations of neighbors, such as compliance with the lease and property rules. Remember, however, that tenants also have responsibilities. Acknowledge when tenants need to contribute to solving problems and examine services that can be put in place to support tenants. All right, that wraps up our Module 3 on supports to assist individuals with obtaining and maintaining their tenancy. So I'd like to encourage everybody to take the final exam that was emailed to you. I'll send it out again in case you missed it for Module 3. And we would like to have that back by Friday the 13th. Ooh. So please make sure that you send it back to us by Friday the 13th. Just circle your answers, scan it into a PDF form, and I will give you my email address right now.